In this lesson, what I want to do is have a bit of a discussion about Office 365. I want to talk about some of the different offerings, want to talk about what it is that we're going to be able to do with it, and also talk about some of the different times, some of the different scenarios, some of the different cases in which we want to let Microsoft host our SharePoint environment. But let's start off by talking a little bit about exactly what Office 365 is all about. In a nutshell, Office 365 is several different Microsoft server products hosted in the cloud, hosted by Microsoft. And this includes, of course, SharePoint, but it also includes Exchange for email, of course, calendaring, Lync for being able to do messaging, conference calls, and even Office, that depending on the license of Office 365 that you get, you may even qualify for local installations of Office 2013 as well. Now, the biggest question right up front is why use Office 365? The number one reason, I think anyway, to use Office 365 is global access. Regardless of where my employees are, regardless of what device it is they're using, they can access their information that's hosted inside of Office 365. In fact, one of the things that you're going to notice if you're using Windows 8, if you're using a Surface, if you're using a Windows Phone, is that Microsoft gives you a lot of great capabilities to be able to incorporate or integrate Office 365 into those client systems as well. So that way, I don't have to worry about publicly exposing out my SharePoint implementation. All of that is handled for me. In addition, Microsoft offers a financially backed, guaranteed service level agreement. They guarantee 3 nines of uptime. Now, I know you might be looking at that and you might be thinking that it's not necessarily all that fantastic, 3 nines. You know, people get all excited about 4 nines or 5 nines worth of uptime. But for most organizations, honestly, 3 nines of uptime is more than they'll typically achieve in their own localized environments. Think about all the hardware costs. Think about everything that needs to be set up in order to achieve that level of uptime. That's quite a bit. That can be quite expensive. And then, of course, you know, there's the prospect of getting the 3 or 4 a.m. phone call when a server does wind up going down. So once again, I can go ahead and I can let Microsoft take care of that. And then we also get into the cost savings. A few years ago, Microsoft used to have this little marketing term where they kept saying, do more with less. And while that little marketing phrase has gone away, the reality hasn't. Every organization these days is trying to do exactly that. They're trying to do more with less. One of the great advantages of using Office 365 is that this can decrease my administrative costs, because I don't need to worry about having somebody around to handle the hardware, to handle Windows, to handle the installation of SharePoint, to manage that local SharePoint installation. So fewer administrators can manage an Office 365 deployment. We also have the hardware costs. We kind of touched on this a couple of seconds ago when we talked a little bit about uptime. So I don't have to worry about setting up my clusters. I don't have to worry about mirroring SQL. I don't have to worry about all the licensing that goes along with all of that. That I'm going to pay a per user fee, and that per user fee is going to scale based on the level of Office 365 that I decide to go with, and that's it. And the last big thing to keep in mind, and this is something that is quite frequently overlooked, is the power consumption. With Office 365, I don't have the servers. Microsoft does. So to keep the lights on, so to speak, that's not out of my pocket. That's out of Microsoft's pocket. So using Office 365 can save you quite a bit of money. Now, where might you decide to use Office 365? Well, by far, the most common time that you're going to use Office 365 is if you're a small to medium-sized organization, where the license costs for SharePoint Enterprise, for SQL Server, for Windows Server is going to far exceed any budget you could hope to put together. But it's not just for small companies. Office 365 does have a place in larger organizations as well. One of the misconceptions that I quite frequently see when it comes to the cloud in general is that a lot of people seem to have this notion that it's an all or nothing proposition, that you have to be all in or not using it at all. And that is 100% false. I don't need to be all in. That I can use Office 365 for maybe certain corners of my solution. One of the biggest things that I see come up quite frequently is a department insists on having their own SharePoint implementation. The number one reason behind all IT decisions: politics. So the manager of this department says, we want our own SharePoint implementation. We don't trust her, or we don't want to share our information, or we want to make sure this isn't part of search, or whatever it is that they might be coming up with. And so, of course, my boss comes down to me and says, hey, this is what we need. And so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, all right, well, if this is truly what they want, here's the dollar amount. And typically at that point, one of two things is going to happen. Either A, they'll actually step up and pay the amount of money, or B, they're going to look at that and they're just going to go, no way. So what we could do instead is we could say to that department, okay, you want a SharePoint deployment? We're not going to do a local SharePoint deployment. We're going to go ahead and host that in the cloud. Another very big reason to use Office 365 is for pilot programs, for testing, for development. When you deploy SharePoint out to your environment and you do it properly, this is going to represent a pretty big shift in how your users do their day-to-day job. And depending on your organization, they might not deal so well with change. So we might not want to invest all the money right up front and get everybody all into SharePoint. Then we want to start doing little teams and then eventually migrate that to our own implementation by first starting with Office 365. Or maybe what we're looking for is proof of concept. Then maybe you've been watching this course here, or maybe you've been reading up on SharePoint, and you decide, hey, I see some value here. And so you head off to your CIO and you say, hey, could we make this happen? And they push back saying, we don't have the budget for that right now. Well, what I could do is I could run up a pilot program and I could start to show what the value of Office 365 is and of SharePoint is. And this could also be a nice place for me to go off and start testing, start doing acceptance testing. One of the biggest things that you'll need to decide on when you start getting into configuring SharePoint is what you want your site, your list, and your folder structure to look like. And sometimes that can take a few revisions. That can take a little bit of back and forth, that I go in, I set things up, I put it back out to my users, they go ahead, they take a look, and they say, yeah, you know what, this isn't really meeting our needs. So what I can very easily do is go in and make the changes and keep going back and forth until finally we find the environment that we're looking for. And so I can go ahead and do all of that inside of Office 365 rather than doing that on a local SharePoint deployment. Now let's talk a little bit about just the SharePoint component here. Let's talk a little bit about SharePoint Online. That first bullet point on this slide is by far the most important bullet point in this lesson. SharePoint Online is SharePoint. Period. End of sentence. SharePoint Online is SharePoint. So basically, everything that you've learned up till now and everything that you're going to be learning later on is going to be applicable in SharePoint Online, with a few exceptions, of course. Now, the biggest thing that we need to remember about SharePoint Online is that we're not going to get a web application. We're not going to get a farm. We're going to get a site collection. And that's where all of our work starts. On top of that, our customization options are also going to be a bit restricted. We can use sandbox solutions. Now, the thing about sandbox solutions is sort of like the name implies, they're sandboxed. They're only going to have limited access to resources. The new way to do things is by utilizing applications. And I'm going to get in and I'm going to talk about that in just a couple of moments here. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about integration and synchronization. Chances are you already have an Active Directory deployment. Your users already have usernames and passwords. And so if we were to use Office 365 and we were to require everybody to learn new usernames, new passwords, guess what? This project is going to fail right from the get-go. It's doomed from the start. Fortunately, we have the capability with Office 365 and the Windows Azure Active Directory Sync tool to synchronize our Active Directory deployment with Office 365. And with the magic of ADFS, our users can authenticate against our network and be seamlessly authenticated against Office 365. Now, the last little thing that I want to mention is about customizations. Office 365 SharePoint Online is SharePoint. But there are still limits on our levels of customization. We have the ability to deploy out sandbox solutions. Sandbox solutions, though, are really a SharePoint 2010 thing, not a 2013 thing. They're there, they still work, but the biggest problem with our sandbox solutions is that it's sort of an all or nothing proposition when it comes to the feature set that you get. That sandbox solutions can be deployed out by a site collection administrator, but they are going to be limited in what it is they're able to do. They're not allowed to leave SharePoint. They're not allowed to modify permissions. So what happens if I want a bit more control over that? Maybe what I really want is I want to allow a customization to be able to access information inside of just one list. Or maybe what I want to do is I want to allow maybe an additional level of access to the customization. And this is where apps or applications come into play. Now, with apps, I have the ability to modify permissions. So I can allow or deny additional levels of access as needed to make sure that my application is doing what I need it to do. When it comes to Office 365, the best thing that I can recommend is go try it. I understand that there's a lot of people that are out there that are a bit nervous about using the cloud, and a lot of it just has to do with a lack of control. It's not my servers, it's not my network. And it's one of those things where I sort of compare it to flying. One of the biggest reasons that people are nervous about flying is because they don't have control. Although statistically speaking, of course, flying is infinitely safer than driving a car. However, since people have control over the car, they feel safer. And a lot of that seems to hold true when we start talking about cloud technologies as well. Since these servers are not on our networks, we have less faith, we have less trust in them. But keep in mind that all of this is going to be hosted by Microsoft. And quite honestly, who am I going to trust more to host an environment? Myself or the paid professionals at Microsoft? Honestly, I'm going to trust Microsoft. So when appropriate, I love implementing Office 365. Has a fantastic time to market that I can very easily implement this with little to no pain, little to no wailing and gnashing of teeth. I'm a huge fan of Office 365. And I'm going to see you in the next lesson.